Operation Biting Bruneval Raid, collection of German radar in 1942. A late winter silence settles over the coast of Normandy in February 1942, as the cold Channel wind slips along the dark cliffs above Bruneval. Beneath the shadows of the German radar station, the waves move with a slow, steady rhythm, brushing the narrow beach where patrols pass in measured steps, their lights flickering faintly against the occupied shoreline. And in that stillness, history waits. Tonight we return to those tense February nights when a small band of British paratroopers set out to seize the secrets of Germany's Würzburg radar, a mission whose quiet success would shape the future of the air war in World War II. The winter of 1942 unfolded across Europe under the long shadow of a war that had already reshaped nations, skies, and the rhythms of daily life. For Britain, the struggle against Germany had entered a new and complex phase. After surviving the intense months of the Battle of Britain in 1940, the Royal Air Force found itself locked in an ongoing contest with the Luftwaffe for control of the night skies. German bombers still crossed the Channel under cover of darkness, guided by increasingly sophisticated electronic systems that helped them bypass the limitations of night navigation. British cities felt the weight of these raids, and the air war grew into a duel not only of aircraft, but of signals, frequencies, and invisible pulses sent across the sky. By early 1942, Germany's night defense network had become a critical factor in its air strategy. Central to this network were radar systems such as the Freya for long-range detection and the Würzburg series for precision tracking. The Würzburg, with its distinctive parabolic dish and control cabin mounted at its rear, was proving particularly effective. Once an enemy aircraft entered its range, the radar could feed precise location data to night fighter units, allowing them to intercept bombers with a speed and accuracy that had not been possible in the earlier years of the war. The British air crews who returned from night missions described encounters with fighters that seemed almost preternaturally guided, appearing at the exact moment and position required for interception. Inside Britain's scientific and intelligence community, these developments triggered urgent concern. At the heart of the effort to understand the German system stood Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, a physicist in his early 30s whose mind worked easily across both abstract theory and battlefield practicality. Jones had already been instrumental in deciphering aspects of Germany's navigational beams and radio systems. Now he turned his attention to the radar chain that formed the backbone of German air defense. Reports, reconnaissance images, and intercepted communications gradually painted a picture of a growing network of radar installations along the coasts of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. While the Freya stations were easier to identify from the air due to their large rectangular antennas, the smaller Würzburg dishes presented a more elusive target. Yet these smaller sets were becoming the key instruments guiding Germany's night fighters. Jones and his colleagues understood that defeating the Würzburg system required more than theoretical deductions. They needed physical components, receivers, transmitters, reflectors, and the delicate circuits that controlled the tracking beam. Only by examining the radar directly could British engineers develop jamming systems capable of disrupting it. The stakes of this technical contest were enormous. If the British failed to counter Würzburg, their night bombing campaign, which was becoming a central offensive strategy, would suffer staggering losses. A breakthrough arrived in late 1941 when photographic reconnaissance flights over the French coast near Bruneval, north of Le Havre, revealed a radar installation that included a Würzburg A. The radar sat on a terrace of land below the edge of the coastal cliffs, part of a German defensive complex that combined radar detection with searchlights and anti-aircraft positions. What made this installation particularly interesting to Jones and the Air Ministry was its layout. Unlike some radar stations heavily fortified or located deep inland, Bruneval's Würzburg lay relatively exposed, with German defensive units positioned farther inland or on the cliffs above. The path from the radar site to the narrow beach below offered a potential route for extraction by sea. British planners quickly realized that a unique opportunity was taking shape. If a small, highly trained force could enter the area at night, seize the radar components, and withdraw before German reinforcements arrived, the operation could provide Britain with the technical information needed to counter one of Germany's most important defensive tools. Yet the challenges were obvious. The site could not be attacked by bomber aircraft without destroying the very equipment the mission sought to capture. Approaching by ship risked detection by German lookouts and radar stations. A raid launched by commandos from the sea alone would face difficulty scaling the cliffs and penetrating inland defenses before escaping. The only viable option was one that combined different branches of the armed forces in precise synchronization. Airborne troops to land silently behind the radar site, seize the equipment, and withdraw downward to the beach, where the Royal Navy would be waiting to extract them. As discussions turned into planning, responsibility for the assault fell to Britain's airborne forces, still in their early stages of development. The Parachute Regiment had been formed less than a year earlier, but its training emphasized speed, surprise, and the ability to complete complex missions with limited manpower. Within this young formation, C Company of the 2nd Battalion was selected for the operation, and its commander, Major John Frost, was given the responsibility of leading the assault. Frost was a disciplined and composed officer, respected by his men for his ability to organize and inspire. His unit had trained intensely over previous months, gaining proficiency in night movement, close quarters action, and handling explosive charges. Yet the Bruneval Raid would demand more than standard infantry skills. It required the precise removal of a technologically valuable and fragile device. To meet this need, a specialized radar technician team from the Royal Air Force was attached to the parachute force. Led by Flight Sergeant C.W.H. Cox, the team studied every available image of the Würzburg radar, familiarizing themselves with the components most valuable for intelligence and the fastest ways to dismantle them. Unlike combat, troops who trained with weapons and explosives, these technicians rehearsed cutting metal, disconnecting cables, and removing instruments by lamplight. Their role would be to work under the protection of Frost's troops once the radar was secured. In addition to airborne forces and technicians, the Royal Navy played a crucial part. Without successful extraction from the beach, the mission would collapse, and the paratroopers would be trapped between German forces converging from the cliffs and the sea. For this task, landing craft and naval personnel were assigned to launch from southern England, cross the channel under cover of darkness, and position themselves close to the French shore without attracting attention. No. 1 Commando, an experienced unit in amphibious operations, would support the naval forces and help manage the extraction. The date chosen for the raid, 27 to 28 of February 1942, fell at a time when the winter nights were still long enough to provide deep cover. This window also aligned with tidal conditions necessary for the landing craft to reach the designated evacuation point along the narrow Bruneval beach. Every element of the operation had to align meticulously. The aircraft carrying the paratroopers had to release them over precise drop zones. The ground forces had to reach the radar quickly. The technicians had to work without error, and the naval forces had to arrive at the correct moment, able to locate and retrieve the raiding party. The terrain around Bruneval introduced additional challenges that shaped the plan. The radar installation sat on a sloping terrace of land below the cliff line, with the beach accessible only through paths that German patrols sometimes used. Surrounding fields, hedges, and isolated buildings created pockets where German sentries might be stationed or reinforcements might gather. Although the site itself was lightly defended, the route to the beach passed through a natural funnel that could be blocked by even a modest German force. British planners understood that a delay of mere minutes could give nearby German units enough time to react, jeopardizing the escape and placing the entire raiding force in danger of being cut off. Such concerns underscored the inherent risk of the mission. The operation depended on surprise and speed, but also on the enemy's uncertainty. If German forces reacted too quickly, Frost's men might find themselves fighting a superior force with no reinforcements and no route of retreat. The sea offered escape, but only if the Royal Navy appeared exactly as planned. A miscalculation in timing, weather, or navigation could transform the operation from a daring strike into a costly loss of men and intelligence. Yet despite these dangers, the potential reward was too significant to ignore. Success could reveal the inner workings of the Würzburg system, enabling British scientists to develop countermeasures that would protect bomber crews during night operations. As February approached, training intensified across all participating units. Frost conducted rehearsals for the assault phase, practicing movements through mock-ups built from timber and canvas to replicate the layout of the radar site. The RAF technicians refined their procedures for dismantling the radar dish and its electronics under low light. Naval personnel timed their approach patterns repeatedly, practicing night landings and recoveries. The synergy between airborne, naval, scientific, and commando elements grew into a coordinated plan, one that demanded trust across different branches of the armed forces. By the final week of preparation, every participant understood both the significance and the fragility of the mission. The Allies were entering a period in the war where technological advantage played an increasingly decisive role. The ability to disrupt German radar defenses would not only save aircraft and crews, but also increase the effectiveness of strategic bombing campaigns aimed at limiting Germany's capacity to wage war. For the men tasked with executing the raid, this knowledge added a sense of purpose to the long nights of training and the cold hours spent studying maps, photographs, and diagrams of the Bruneval coast. On the eve of the operation, the raiders gathered their equipment and prepared for departure from airfields in southern England. They carried not only weapons and explosives, but also the quiet understanding that they stood at the intersection of strategy, science, and human risk. As they climbed into the aircraft that would take them across the channel, they stepped into a mission designed to reach into the technological core of the German war effort, extract a crucial secret, and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. The stage was set for one of the most focused and daring raids of the early war, an operation where success depended not on overwhelming force, but on precision, coordination, and the ability to move through the occupied night as swiftly and silently as the wind along the cliffs above Bruneval. Training for the Bruneval Raid unfolded in a quiet corner of the British countryside, where winter winds swept across open fields and the damp smell of earth lingered beneath heavy skies. The paratroopers who would carry out the mission moved through these days with a sense of focus that went beyond ordinary preparation. They knew from the first briefing that this was no typical assault. Their task was to seize, preserve, and extract the components of a German Würzburg radar, an objective that required a mixture of speed, stealth, and careful handling uncommon in commando operations. To prepare them, engineers had constructed a full-sized wooden replica of the radar, its frame built from detailed analysis of aerial photographs. It stood on the training grounds like a strange, unfamiliar machine, its circular dish rendered in timber, but accurate enough for the men to learn how to move around it without damaging what they would one day attempt to take. Day after day, squads advanced on the mock structure, rehearsing silent approaches from different angles of the field. They practiced forming a perimeter, securing the area, and guiding the RAF technicians into position. The technicians themselves trained nearby under dim red lights that cast only the faintest glow. Red light was chosen because it could be used in occupied territory without projecting far enough to be seen from the distance of a German sentry post. Under that muted illumination, the technicians worked methodically, assembling and disassembling sections of the wooden mock-up. They handled metal tools with deliberate slowness, testing the movements they would need to perform quickly but quietly in France. Each man committed the steps to memory: where to cut, where to lift, where to separate one component from another without breaking it. Meanwhile, far from the fields where the airborne troops drilled, the Royal Navy practiced its own part of the mission. Landing craft patrolled English waters on moonless nights, learning to approach narrow strips of shoreline with only small lamps and coded signals to guide them. The coxswains perfected their timing against shifting tides and dark silhouettes, preparing themselves for the moment they would need to slip beneath the cliffs at Bruneval without attracting German attention. Every element of the operation depended on these rehearsals being precise. The paratroopers had to reach the ground undetected. The technicians had to complete their work swiftly. And the Navy had to be waiting at the exact moment the raiding party arrived at the beach below the cliffs. The plan grew clearer with each passing day. Frost divided his force into 3 elements: an assault group responsible for storming the radar site itself, a blocking group tasked with holding back any German reinforcements likely to come from Le Havre, and a beach group that would secure the extraction point. These roles interlocked with one another, and each man came to understand not only his individual task, but its place in the larger design. In the quiet moments after long hours of practice, they studied maps, memorized landmarks, and reflected on the unusual nature of the mission. This was not about defeating an enemy, it was about learning from him. On the evening of 27 February 1942, the raiding force gathered at the airfield. The winter air pressed cold against their uniforms as they stepped onto the tarmac, parachutes strapped tightly to their backs, weapons slung across their chests. 12 Whitley aircraft waited with engines idling softly, their dark shapes glistening faintly beneath the dim runway lights. Inside the cabins, the crew chiefs made final checks, securing cargo, verifying equipment lists, and confirming the flight path that would take them across the channel. The paratroopers boarded in practiced order, taking their places on the narrow benches along the fuselage walls. The interior lights were low, barely illuminating the curved metal surfaces of the aircraft and the outlines of the men seated close together. Outside, the sky hung heavy with low clouds. A gentle wind moved across the airfield, conditions that offered both advantages and concerns. The clouds would hide the Whitleys from German observers along the French coast, but they also complicated navigation for the pilots. Still, after weeks of preparation, the time had come. One by one, the aircraft rumbled forward, gathering speed until they lifted into the night, engines humming steadily as they climbed through the darkness. Inside the cabin, the noise of the engines filled the space with a rhythmic vibration that felt almost soothing. Men reached down to tighten straps, adjust equipment bags, or check the buckles of their harnesses. The faint light cast their features in calm, muted tones. Some closed their eyes, not to sleep, but to focus, reviewing the sequence of movements they would perform after landing. Others leaned slightly toward the small, circular windows, watching distant lights disappear beneath a layer of cloud as the aircraft crossed the English coastline. The mission ahead hung over the cabin like a quiet weight, shared but unspoken. The flight across the channel was steady, the hum of the engines rising and falling gently as the Whitleys moved through pockets of thicker cloud. Occasionally the aircraft dipped or shifted in response to coastal winds, but the pilots held course. Below, the sea was invisible, its presence felt only through a subtle change in the air. As the aircraft neared the French coast, the crew chief signaled for readiness, and a soft red glow filled the cabin. The men stood, clipped their static lines, and waited in silence as the pilot circled toward the drop point. The green light came on without ceremony. One by one, the paratroopers stepped through the door, leaving behind the warmth of the cabin and entering the cold rush of February air. The sudden quiet of open space enveloped them as they fell, broken only by the rush of wind and the snap of parachutes deploying above. The ground below emerged slowly from the darkness. Faint outlines of fields, hedgerows, and scattered farm buildings formed a landscape they had studied for weeks. They touched down with practiced steadiness, gathering their parachutes swiftly and moving away from open ground. A few men had drifted off course, caught by slight variations in wind direction, but most landed close enough to the planned drop zones to regroup without difficulty. Frost assembled the main assault group quickly, checking that the technicians were present and that all equipment bags were accounted for. The darkness lay thick across the fields, broken only by faint shapes of trees and the distant glimmer of the sea beyond the cliffs. The blocking force moved immediately toward the road linking Bruneval to Le Havre, keeping low as they advanced along depressions in the ground. Their path wound through patches of grass wet with dew, and their boots made little sound. Further south, the beach party made its way toward the descent route to the shore, navigating slowly in order to remain unseen. The assault group headed toward the radar site, following a shallow track that offered partial cover from the direction of the buildings ahead. The faint light spilling from a window in the German quarters flickered briefly across the field, and the paratroopers paused until it dimmed again. With each step, the outline of the radar dish grew more distinct. The paratroopers felt the subtle shift in atmosphere that comes when anticipation sharpens into action. Ahead lay the first objective of the night, silent and unaware beneath the winter sky, waiting in the darkness as the raiding party approached. The final stretch toward the radar station unfolded in near silence, broken only by the faint rustle of uniforms brushing against winter grass. Frost signaled for the assault group to slow their pace. Ahead, the buildings of the German installation stood in muted outline, a handful of small structures, a fenced perimeter, and the unmistakable silhouette of the Würzburg A radar, its parabolic dish angled upward toward the dark sky as though listening for distant echoes. The site looked quiet, almost too quiet, but reconnaissance had confirmed that only a small detachment of Luftwaffe personnel manned the radar at night. These operators belonged to a branch responsible for handling radar equipment rather than frontline combat, and British planners had counted on this detail to provide the narrow window of opportunity the mission required. As the paratroopers crept closer, the stillness of the night seemed to thicken, amplifying every thought and motion. Frost waited until his men were lined along the final stretch of cover, then gave the signal. The assault unfolded with practiced swiftness. Paratroopers rushed forward in short bursts, keeping themselves low and tight to the ground. A German sentry, startled by the sudden movement, shouted an alarm, but the British fire was controlled and immediate. The short, sharp crack of their weapons cut through the night, overwhelming the guards before they could mount a coordinated defense. Within moments, the outer posts fell silent, the initial danger overcome. Inside the main building, lights flickered, and a few German operators emerged in confusion. They found themselves surrounded by armed men, moving with confidence and precision. Several surrendered without resistance, hands raised, their surprise evident at the swiftness of the attack. Others attempted to retreat deeper into the installation, but the paratroopers blocked their path and brought the situation under control. Frost ensured the prisoners were secured, understanding that their knowledge of the equipment, even at a basic level, could prove valuable once they were questioned back in Britain. With the immediate threat neutralized, Frost motioned for the RAF technicians to advance. They moved quickly toward the radar, their tools already in hand. The technicians approached the Würzburg antenna with a mixture of urgency and reverence. In the dim light, the dish's curved surface gleamed faintly, the result of German engineering that had been studied only from photographs until now. The men understood exactly which parts needed to be removed and which could be left behind. With careful motions, they began by loosening the bolts connecting the parabolic reflector to its mount, working as quietly as possible, despite the metallic clicks that occasionally broke the stillness. Other technicians focused on the control cabin behind the dish, disconnecting cables, removing the critical receiver transmitter assembly, and placing each component into padded bags that paratroopers held open and ready. They relied heavily on touch, guided by the memory of their rehearsals under red-tinted lamps in England. The only illumination came from small, shielded lights clipped to their uniforms, casting narrow beams that barely reached beyond their hands. Each movement was deliberate and steady, timed with the understanding that every passing minute increased the risk of German reinforcements arriving. Inside the operations room, a separate team searched quickly but thoroughly. They examined equipment racks, noting serial numbers and removing smaller modules that might contain valuable clues to the radar's frequency or pulse patterns. They collected technical manuals, notebooks, and any documents the operators had left behind. A camera clicked softly in the corner as a paratrooper photographed certain elements of the installation for later analysis, images that would help confirm how the system had been configured in the field. Then, from a distance, the sound of gunfire drifted across the night. It was not close, but it was unmistakable. The blocking force had engaged German reinforcements moving from the direction of Le Havre, just as the planners had anticipated. The shots came in uneven bursts, rising and falling with the shifting contours of the terrain. Frost knew what it meant. Time was narrowing. He urged the technicians to speed up as much as possible without jeopardizing the delicate equipment. The men worked faster, the rhythm of their tools gaining a new urgency, though their motions remained careful enough to avoid snapping wires or bending components. Once the essential pieces of the Würzburg radar had been removed and secured, Frost scanned the perimeter to confirm that the assault group remained in control. The prisoners were guarded, the site had been thoroughly checked, and the last of the technicians stepped back from the dish with their final load. The paratroopers redistributed the weight of the equipment among themselves, tightening straps and adjusting their gear to ensure they could move quickly. A final sweep of the building ensured nothing critical had been overlooked. Frost gave the order to withdraw. The raiding party began its movement toward the beach, the technicians positioned among the paratroopers for protection. The path led them downward across sloping ground toward the cliffs, where a narrow descent curved through scrub and loose stones. Above them, distant flares began to rise into the sky, German forces signaling their growing awareness that something significant had happened at the radar site. The pale light cast shifting shadows across the fields, brushing the tops of hedgerows and flashing momentarily across the helmets of the withdrawing British soldiers. Yet the night still held enough darkness to shield their movements. The blocking force continued to slow the German approach, firing carefully to preserve ammunition while keeping enemy units from pushing too far forward. Their discipline allowed the main body to move without being overtaken. As the paratroopers descended toward the beach, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of the sea. The sound of waves became clearer, soft, persistent, steady, a quiet contrast to the intermittent gunfire echoing from the inland fields. The final approach to the beach required the men to move carefully across sand that shifted under their boots, its cold grains catching faintly in the wind. Above them, German flares rose again, illuminating parts of the cliff in a pale, trembling glow. The paratroopers paused in the darker patches of shadow until the light faded, then continued downward. Frost looked toward the shoreline, searching for the signal he expected. Moments later, it appeared, a flicker of light from offshore. a coded lamp message from the Royal Navy indicating that the landing craft had reached their designated position. The beach group moved ahead, clearing the final stretch of sand and ensuring the extraction point remained free of obstacles. The landing craft emerged through the darkness as low, shadowed shapes, their engines barely audible above the sound of the surf. Naval personnel leapt onto the beach, helping guide the raiders toward the boats. Prisoners were transferred first, then the carefully wrapped radar components. Each item was handled with the same care shown during the dismantling process, as even a sudden jolt could damage the delicate equipment the entire mission had been designed to capture. As the last men boarded, distant flashes appeared from the top of the cliffs. The Germans had reached positions overlooking the beach and opened fire with small arms and mortars. Shells burst along the sand, throwing up dark sprays of earth that fell harmlessly into the water. The landing craft pulled away from the shore at once, engines rising to a louder pitch as the crews pushed for distance. Bullets struck the water in narrow lines, but the raiders were already moving beyond effective range. The boats turned toward the open channel, gathering speed as they slipped back into the protective embrace of darkness. Behind them, the coastal cliffs receded into shadow. The lights of German search teams flickered faintly on the heights, sweeping back and forth across the ground the paratroopers had crossed only minutes earlier. But the raiding force was already out of reach, the mission accomplished. The radar components lay safely aboard the craft, wrapped and secured, their secrets waiting to be uncovered in British laboratories. The prisoners, silent and subdued, sat under guard as the boats continued their journey toward the English coast. The wind over the channel carried a chill, but it felt different now, less like the cold of an enemy shore and more like the steady breath of returning safely. The men sat quietly, letting the tension of the night ease from their shoulders. Somewhere behind them, the Germans would piece together what had happened, but by then the raiders would be long gone. The extraction had succeeded, the mission had reached its end, and the sea carried them back toward home. The night along the cliffs of Bruneval had grown heavier as the operation unfolded, the sea below breathing in long, steady waves that rose and fell against the cold sand. Frost's men were deep within the most fragile stage of their mission, though no single moment announced itself as the beginning of the climax. Rather, the tension seemed to gather gradually, like mist forming along the coastline, silent yet unmistakable. Every step, every movement, every faint sound now felt sharper than before, as if the darkness itself had begun to lean closer around them. The technicians worked with quiet determination beside the Würzburg radar, their hands guided more by memory than by sight. The lamplights clipped to their jackets cast only narrow circles of warmth, soft glows that revealed little beyond the reach of their tools. For a time the world around them felt suspended, no voices, no footsteps, only the quiet mechanical rhythm of clamps turning, bolts loosening, metal shifting in controlled motions. Frost watched from the edge of the perimeter, listening for any sound along the inland path, sensing the weight of responsibility pressing more firmly across his shoulders. Behind the team, the absence of several paratroopers lingered like a muted ache. Those men had drifted too far during the drop, carried off course by unpredictable gusts along the cliff line. It was only minutes, perhaps less, that their absence altered the formation, yet it had left Frost with a difficult choice. Waiting for them would mean losing the narrow advantage of surprise. Moving forward meant accepting that some would fall into danger before ever reaching their intended positions. The operation allowed no second chances. Frost had led the assault group onward, knowing that their strength lay in momentum, not numbers. Now, as he looked over the scene unfolding around the radar, he felt again the weight of that decision, necessary, but not without cost. The technicians had just eased one of the most sensitive components from its housing, a section of the receiver assembly that British scientists regarded as the heart of the system, when a faint sputter broke the horizon. It was a small sound, easily mistaken for distant gunfire, but within seconds it revealed itself for what it truly was: the climbing hiss of a German illumination flare. Slowly, with a kind of eerie grace, the flare rose upward through the night. Its arc traced a pale line behind the rooftops, drifting higher until it bloomed into a bright white sphere above the valley. The light spread outward, spilling in soft sheets across the fields and the faint path the raiders had taken only minutes earlier. The men froze where they stood. The flare crackled overhead, turning patches of ground into pale islands of clarity. The technicians lowered their heads, shielding the component they had just removed. Frost narrowed his eyes, trying to read whether the flare would expose their position. For several long seconds, the entire operation hung in that fragile balance. If the wind carried the light just slightly farther, if the flare drifted a few meters deeper into the hollow behind the radar station, the raiders would be outlined in full view, silhouettes against the machinery they had come to capture. It would take only a single German observer, a single watchman, glancing from the direction of the road to raise the alarm fully. And if that happened, there would be no time to complete the work, no time to move toward the cliffs, no time to reach the beach before German patrols blocked every exit. But the light, bright as it was, fell just short of revealing the raiders. It cast its glow across the open ground, but left the depression around the radar in relative darkness. The dish, still partly intact, stood like a great curved shadow shielding the technicians from direct exposure. Frost watched the flare fade slowly, its brilliance dissolving into a soft haze before the night reclaimed its depth. He exhaled through his nose quietly, the sound disappearing into the wind. The moment passed, but its echo remained. The technicians resumed their work with renewed urgency, fingers moving more quickly now, tools clicking softly against metal with a subtle tremor of haste. They had been trained for this, working under pressure, working under tight time constraints, working with the understanding that discovery could arrive at any moment. Yet even with that preparation, the nearness of danger left its mark on each of them. What had moments earlier felt like a controlled extraction now felt like a race against a tightening perimeter of time. Another element of uncertainty lay far from the radar site, out on the surface of the water where the Royal Navy craft pushed through the night. A low mist had crept across the channel, rolling in gentle layers that obscured the cliffs and hemmed the coastline in an indistinct blur. The coxswains had reduced the speed, worried that an early approach might run them aground too far from the extraction point. The landing craft moved with careful precision, engines low, lamps shielded, their crews listening for the faint echo of surf against stone. They knew their timing mattered as much as the actions of the men inland. If they arrived late, even 10 minutes late, the paratroopers would find themselves cornered, at the edge of the cliffs with no way to escape except through encirclement. The mist made it difficult to judge distance. Shadows on the water stretched strangely, and the cliffs seemed to shift position with every change of wind. The commanders aboard the landing craft traded short, tightly controlled whispers as they made adjustments. A degree too far north risked missing the signal entirely. A degree too far south placed them beneath German lookout points. Every meter counted, every minute counted. Somewhere inland, Frost's teams moved closer to the final part of their mission, and the Navy had to be there to meet them. Back at the radar site, the technicians completed the last major disassembly they had time to attempt. The dish itself, massive and unwieldy, could not be transported, nor could the main gear mechanism beneath it. The rotating assembly was far too heavy, anchored into a base they could not hope to dismantle quickly. They removed what they could: essential circuits, receiver units, a portion of the feed system, documentation from the operations room. They damaged what they could not carry, but even this had limits. There were no explosives suited to tearing apart the sturdy mount. The Germans would not be able to restore it immediately, but they would restore it eventually. The raiders knew this, though it mattered little compared to the value of the components now secured in their packs. As they regrouped to depart, Frost silently counted the men present. Several, from the scattered drop, still had not returned. Their absence tightened something in his chest, though he showed nothing outwardly. The mission had to continue. The beach was still ahead of them, the path along the cliffs still waiting, and the Germans, alerted now by the flare and the faint reports of distant skirmishes, were drawing closer. The withdrawal unfolded with careful discipline. The blocking force continued to hold the inland road, engaging in controlled bursts to delay the advancing Germans. The main group moved swiftly down the narrow descent toward the shore. The sand, when they reached it, lay cold beneath their boots, its grains shifting softly under each step. The wind carried the salt of the sea and the lingering echoes of distant gunfire. Above them, another flare arced through the sky, but this one rose farther inland, illuminating the fields they had already left behind. Frost signaled for the men to pause in the deeper shadows along the base of the cliff. The beach stretched ahead in muted gray scale, the water shifting in quiet ripples that reflected only faint hints of starlight. The raiders listened to the darkness, waiting for confirmation. And then it came, a brief flicker offshore, a coded lamp signal cutting through the mist. Relief came not as a surge, but as a quiet, steadying sensation. The timing had held. They moved toward the water just as the landing craft closed the final distance. Naval personnel jumped down to help guide the raiders aboard. The technicians passed their bags of equipment carefully, ensuring that nothing struck the boat's metal sides too harshly. Prisoners were ushered forward. Engines rose to a fuller hum. Then the first German mortar shells arrived at the beach, landing in dark eruptions that sent sand spraying into the surf. The craft pulled away from the shore, gaining distance as tracers reached toward them from the cliffs above. None struck the boat. None found their mark. The sea widened around them, the cliffs shrinking into shadow. The raiders sat in near silence, exhausted but steady, the weight of the operation lifting slowly from their shoulders. Behind them, the sounds of the German search faded into the wind. They had secured what they had come for. What they could not carry, they had damaged as much as time allowed. What they could not prevent, they accepted with the quiet understanding that no mission, no matter how well planned, could claim perfection. And as the boats turned toward England, the night around them seemed to widen once more, carrying them away from danger and into the long, calm darkness of the Channel. And when the night's tension finally eased, its consequences began to unfold. The men who had crossed the Channel under cover of darkness now found themselves back on British soil, stepping into the cool February air as if returning from a world that existed only for a few hours and would never be repeated in quite the same way. The quiet along the coast felt strangely distant from the urgency they had left behind at Bruneval. Yet even in those first minutes on shore, it was clear that what they carried with them, the carefully wrapped pieces of the Wurzburg radar, would reach far beyond the memory of the raid itself. The equipment was brought almost immediately to the scientific intelligence team led by R.V. Jones. For months, Jones and his colleagues had relied on inference, intercepted signals, aerial photographs, and fragmentary reports from pilots who had flown near German radar fields. Now, for the first time, they had the chance to examine an intact portion of the system that had puzzled them for so long. Under the bright lamps of their laboratory, the components took on an entirely different relevance. They were no longer anonymous objects in an enemy installation, but tangible keys to understanding how the Luftwaffe tracked and intercepted British bombers. Jones and his team worked with an intensity shaped by years of frustration. As they mapped the circuits and measured the frequencies, they uncovered the operational secrets that had once given German night fighter controllers such an advantage. They identified the exact wavelength the Wurzburg relied upon, the sensitivity of its receiving systems, the limitations of its tracking precision, and the engineering choices that made it a central pillar of Germany's air defense network. Insights that had once been theoretical suddenly became practical. The scientists no longer had to guess. They knew. From these discoveries emerged a clearer roadmap for countermeasures. Techniques that had been under development, such as radar jamming and deception, could now be refined with confidence. Most significant was the validation of a concept the RAF had debated for months. Window, the thin strips of aluminum foil that, when dropped from aircraft, created clouds of false echoes on radar screens. The understanding of Würzburg's structure and frequency allowed British planners to tailor window more precisely, ensuring it overwhelmed German detection systems during large-scale bombing operations. When window was finally introduced in 1943, it helped shield entire bomber streams as they crossed into heavily defended airspace. Few who used it ever knew that its success began on a cold night along the French coast, in the brief window of time when technicians worked under the shadow of a German flare. Across the Channel, the German reaction showed a mix of confusion and urgency. When officers arrived at the Bruneval station after the raid, they quickly understood that this had not been a simple act of sabotage. Too many components were missing, and the cutting marks left no doubt that the British had chosen their targets carefully. Orders were issued to tighten security at radar sites along the coast, guard rotations were increased, and additional fortifications were planned for installations near cliffs or beaches where small groups might land undetected. Yet even as the Germans took these measures, they lacked the one piece of information that mattered most. They did not know exactly which parts of the Würzburg had been taken, nor how much the British now understood. In that uncertainty lay one of the raid's unspoken victories. For the British airborne forces, the success of the operation carried its own form of significance. Operation Biting had been one of the earliest tests of Britain's growing airborne capability, a chance to prove that paratroopers could be dropped at night, operate far from conventional support, and extract themselves under pressure. The raid validated months of training and helped shape the confidence of airborne units that would later take on far larger, more complex missions. It strengthened the reputation of Major John Frost, whose leadership at Bruneval would be remembered long after his stand at Arnhem became iconic. His calm decision-making under conditions of uncertainty showed what airborne officers would need in the years ahead. The human cost of the raid, though smaller than that of many wartime operations, remained part of the story. 2 British soldiers lost their lives, 6 were wounded, and 6 were captured after landing too far from the main force. Those captured would spend the remainder of the war in German hands, their part in the raid unknown to their captors. German losses were more substantial than early reports suggested. 5 soldiers were killed, 2 were wounded, 2 were taken prisoner, and 3 were reported missing. No victory came without losses, and the raiders understood this as well as anyone. Their success, however meaningful, carried the soft shadow of those who had not returned. The legacy of Bruneval extended far beyond the laboratories and briefings that followed. It became an example studied by planners who sought to achieve large results with small, precise actions. The raid showed that a well-coordinated force could slip behind enemy lines, strike at a vital system, and withdraw before the enemy fully understood what had occurred. It demonstrated the fragile power of surprise and the effectiveness of tightly focused objectives. In the broader history of the war, Bruneval became one of the early models for small raids with large consequences, a pattern that echoed through later operations against communications posts, mechanical systems, and other specialized targets. As the war progressed and the air battle evolved around new technologies and countermeasures, the impact of the raid remained woven into the changing methods of electronic warfare. Those who studied it in retrospect often remarked on how its significance did not lie in the noise it made, but in the clarity it gave. A single night, a small group of men, a narrow window of time, and yet the ripples of what they accomplished continued to spread long after The waves wash smooth the sand beneath the cliffs of Bruneval. The wind along the Normandy coast returns in a soft, steady breath, carrying with it the quiet memory of a night when shadows, courage, and knowledge intertwined. The sea moves gently against the sand, as if reminding us that even the briefest hours can shift the course of a much larger story. In war, there are nights only a few hours long, yet they change the direction of an entire conflict. If you enjoy these softly told journeys into history, please subscribe to World War II History for Sleep to join us in the stories still to come.